Well, I'm on the banks of the River Frome, a few miles east of Dorchester, in Dorset. I'm not really here to try and catch a trout. I'm here to try and catch what it was that inspired Thomas Hardy to write all those wonderful books and poems. This is all Hardy country. His Egdon Heath over there, his Mellstock, where he was born, lived, and died, and wrote his wonderful verse and novels. Hugh Thomas, you're a blue badge guide, yes?
Yes, and I bring people here from all over the world, from America.
Generally more than just one.
Yes, like or like us, or in larger groups.
And where are we going to start?
Well, we're starting at Higher Bockhampton, at the cottage in which Hardy was born, and where he spent his youth and his as a young man. And we're going to meet Joe Linney, the custodian. The cottage belongs to the National Trust.
Our house stood quite alone, and those tall firs and beeches were not planted. Snakes and efts swarmed in the summer days, and nightly bats would fly about our bedrooms. Heathcroppers lived on the hills and were our only friends. So wild it was when first we settled here.
Quite wild in those days.
Yeah, just a lovely cottage, beautiful. Ah, Joe Linney.
Yes, oh, and nice to see you.
And you. When did the Hardy family first come here?
They first came here in 1800. They came over from Puddletown. Hardy's grandfather and grandmother were the first ones in here.
What is it that one hears about possibly losing our great writer at his birth?
The midwife put the baby aside because they didn't think it was going to live, and attended the mother. But then afterwards, she said there seemed to be some life there, and they revived him, and that's why we've got our great author. He went on to live for 88 years.
Yes, marvellous. It's good for the midwife.
Yes, thankful.
And how long did he live here?
He was domiciled here for the first 34 years of his life, you see, when he married.
34 years?
Yes. He went away on his architectural jobs to London and that, but he was always pleased to come back to his West Country home.
Don't blame him. And about Hardy's Wessex, now I know there was the kingdom of Wessex in the medieval, not medieval, long before then.
Yeah.
But Hardy's Wessex is something slightly different, smaller, isn't it? What is Hardy's Wessex?
Well, Hardy, in his stories, he expanded it gradually, but the first time that you will come across Wessex in his novels is in Far From the Madding Crowd, which is set at Puddletown.
Ah, Puddletown, that's where we're off to next.
That's right, we're off to Puddletown, or Weatherbury, as Hardy would have called it.
Hardy was a great one for inventing names, wasn't he? And not only the names of all the places around here, but the names of the characters too. I love Bathsheba Everdeen, Gabriel Oak, Sergeant Troy. Which of those is connected with this place?
Well, this is the house that Hardy made the home of his lady farmer, Bathsheba Everdeen. It's actually called Waterston Manor. It's not normally open to the public.
Hardy put his own relatives into his books, didn't he, under different names?
Very much so. In fact, there's a lovely story that in his bicycling days in the 90s, when he bicycled through the middle of Puddletown, he would look neither to the left nor the right in case he had to recognise one of these cousins.
Are there any of his relatives now in these parts?
Well, of course, Hardy had no direct descendants, but he had hundreds of cousins. And we've arranged to meet one of them here, John Antel.
Oh, good, good. John, what is your relationship with Hardy and Hardy's family?
We're close cousins. My great-great-grandmother was Hardy's grandmother. We shared the same house at Hirebog, Hampton, years ago, and Hardy spent a great deal of time at Puddletown,
Yes.
family house.
What was Hardy like, personally?
Well, my father and my uncle and aunt used to visit regularly with my grandfather when they were young, and they always described him as a very austere sort of person who insisted upon being addressed as Mr. Hardy.
Even amongst the close
Yes,
family.
that's right, yeah.
Mr. Hardy. He used his relatives a great deal in his novels, didn't he?
Yes, indeed. And family tradition within the family told me that he used members of the family and local people. He used my grandfather partly for dupe in Jude the Obscure,
Yes.
and also in Tessa the d'Urbervilles, and especially his temperament. But in Far from the Madding Crowd, my great-grandfather was the maltster.
That's Puddletown.
At
isn't it?
Puddletown.
Yes, yes. Has Puddletown changed a tremendous amount? I suppose it has.
Yes, indeed. But there's no comparison with it as Hardy knew it when he was a lad.
No.
I suppose the church is probably the main building that is left unaltered.
Now, what was it happened at the church?
The Sergeant Troy in Far
Yes.
from the Madding Crowd spent the night there. And if you recall, there was this tremendous torrent of rain that came down and despoiled the grave of his lover, Fanny Robbins, strewed all the flowers about.
Well, where do we go next?
Well, we're going into Dorchester, the hub of the world for Bathsheba and all those people in Far from the Madding Crowd. That's where they went to market and to shop and to get the latest gossip and so on. And of course, I suppose it's best described in the next novel, that's The Mayor of Casterbridge.
Yes, it is Casterbridge, isn't it?
It is Casterbridge,
yes,
that's
yeah.
right.
What an old-fashioned place it seems to be, said Elizabeth Jane. It is all huddled together and is shut in by a square wall of trees like a plot of garden ground by a box edging. It was compact as a box of dominoes. It had no suburbs in the ordinary sense. Country and town met in a mathematical line. To birds of a more soaring kind, Casterbridge must have appeared on this fine evening as a mosaic work of subdued reds, browns, greys and crystals, held together by a rectangular frame of deep green. The mass became gradually dissected by the vision into towers, gables, chimneys and casements. From the centre of each side of this tree-bound square ran avenues, east, west and south, into the wide expanse of cornland and coombe to the distance of a mile or so. It was by one of these avenues that the pedestrians were about to enter. Why we come to the bank, Hugh?
Well, this is Michael Henchard's house, the Mayor of Casterbridge's house.
Ah.
And of course, this would have been a house that Hardy would have known very, very well indeed. Just over behind us is where he went to school, and down the road there is where he trained as an architect and where he worked as an assistant architect.
Difficult to imagine this as it was in Hardy's time. The different buildings, of course, and sheep being driven to market up and down here.
It's difficult to imagine, but in fact this is a very typical house of the well-to-do tradesmen of the time. Michael Henchard had this splendid house, Georgian house, behind a rather beautiful garden, and then, like all the other tradesmen, he would have had his business premises behind the garden.
Of course, Hardy had a marvellous sense of history, did he not, and the feeling for the past. And not only the past of his novels, but the Roman past, the antique past.
Yes, particularly the Roman past in The Mayor of Casterbridge.
Yes.
And he has a passage where he said that the locals were quite used to digging up the bones of Roman soldiers in their back gardens and so on. In fact, he found some bones of a similar sort of age when they were digging the foundations for Max Gate.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Where could I go to see some of the Roman past of Dorset?
Well, I think one of the best places would be the Roman amphitheatre, Malmesbury Rings.
Malmesbury Rings.
Yes, this was a Roman amphitheatre, and it goes on right through history. It has rather a gloomy, sinister, ghostly past. The public gallows stood there for many years.
Melancholy, impressive, lonely, yet accessible from every part of the town, the historic circle was the frequent spot for appointments of a furtive kind. Some boys had recently tried to impart gaiety to the ruin by using the central arena as a cricket ground, but the game usually languished. Possibly the boys were too timid. For some old people said that at certain moments in the summertime, in broad daylight, persons sitting with a book or dozing in the arena had, on lifting their eyes, beheld the slopes lined with a gazing legion of Hadrian's soldiery, as if watching the gladiatorial combat, and had heard the roar of their excited voices. There are ghosts and associations of Hardy at every turn. And in Dorchester, you meet the mayor of Casterbridge or his characters around every corner. What reason are we coming here? What do you associate this particular?
Well, two things really. Susan Henchard, that's Henchard's wife, is supposed to be buried up there in the churchyard of St George's. Mm-hmm. And a little bit further down the river, over there, Michael Henchard nearly threw himself in.
The Mayor of Casterbridge is reckoned to be one of his blackest novels, isn't it?
Well, certainly the ending, Michael Henchard's death, there he is, he dies, he's lost all his possessions, he has been rejected by the girl who thought was his daughter, he dies alone except for Abel Whittle, out there, forlorn, ill, and dying on the heath.
Ah, Egdon Heath. The sombre stretch of rounds and hollows seemed to rise and meet the evening gloom in pure sympathy. The heath exhaling darkness as rapidly as the heavens precipitated it. And so the obscurity in the air and the obscurity in the land closed together in a black fraternization towards which each advanced halfway. The place became full of a watchful intentness now. For when other things sank brooding to sleep, the heath appeared slowly to awake and listen. Every night, its titanic form seemed to await something. But it had waited thus, unmoved, during so many centuries, through the crises of so many things, that it could only be imagined to await one last crisis, the final overthrow. Any exploration of Hardy's Wessex is bound to lead here to the village of Stinsford, just outside Dorchester, because this is where Hardy's heart lies buried. His ashes are in Westminster Abbey, but he wanted his heart to be buried here in, symbolically, the heart of his beloved Dorset. His characters worked and lived in the villages around here, and there is one in particular whom visitors want to track down. She is the heroine of his favorite novel and his own favorite, Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Oh, I've seen Tess's cottage all over Dorset, but my guide Hugh Thomas tells me that Tess did work here.
Yes.
Hugh, where are we?
Yes, this is Lower Lewell Farm, which is accepted to be Talbot Hayes.
Talbot Hayes, you call it?
That's right, yes.
Very stupid and unhardy of me, but I read it to myself as Talbothies.
Ah. Well, it was the dairy farm that she came as a dairymaid.
Mm-hmm. Has it changed a good deal since then, I've no doubt?
Yes, the barn would have been here when she was here, but virtually everything else has changed. And of course, dairying has changed out of all recognitions in the last 100 years.
Yes. But Tess was happy here.
Tess was extremely happy. This is the place where it was always high summer, where she fell in love.
During this month of wonderful afternoons, they roved along the meads by creeping paths which followed the brinks of trickling tributary brooks, hopping across by little wooden bridges to the other side and back again. They were never out of the sound of some purling weir whose buzz accompanied their own murmuring, while the beams of the sun, almost horizontal as the mead itself, formed a pollen of radiance over the landscape. How did Tess come to be here?
Well, Tess had to leave home to look for work to support her family. And her first attempt to do this was to work for her alleged rich relatives, the d'Urbervilles.
Where did the name d'Urberville come from?
There was a real family, a real old Dorset family, whose graves are found in the church at Beer Regis, which Hardy called King's Beer. Well, that first attempt was a complete disaster. Alec d'Urberville seduced her. She had a baby that died. So the second attempt was down here. She came here to work as a dairymaid at Talbot Hayes, and here she met Angel Clare, and they got married. And on her wedding night at Woolbridge Manor, she confessed this early indiscretions, and this was far too much for him. He completely rejected her, and they split up, and so Tess had to set out on her travels again. She had to return home up to the north.
North, is that where we're going next?
That's right, up that way, yes.
Of course, Hardy's characters took some pretty arduous journeys, either on foot or in a comparative luxury of a horse-drawn vehicle.
Yes, well, of course, luxury is the word for this vehicle. This is a gentleman's sporting gig, the kind of sports car of the day, and it was in just this sort of vehicle that Alec d'Urberville gave Tess such a fright in the ride.
It can't have been much fun in the rain, I should think.
No, but again, in Tess, there were compensations. Angel and Tess were driving the milk churns to catch the milk train at Wool, and on the way back it rained, and so they huddled under a tarpaulin, and Angel proposed yet again, and that time Tess accepted him.
Yes. And now we're heading north for
up
Tess's
north there
homeland.
to Tess's homeland. That's right, yes. Steady, girl, steady, steady.
How long did Hardy live in Sturminster?
Just about 2 years. They moved around a great deal when they were first married, and this was the place they first settled down. And Hardy said afterwards that this was the happiest 2 years of his married life.
I had the impression that their married life was not all that happy.
No, it wasn't. As time went on, they became more and more estranged.
Why was that?
Well, a number of reasons. I mean, it's always difficult to play the role of the wife of a genius.
Yeah.
And as time went on, I think Emma began to disapprove, literally, of Hardy's later novels on moral grounds.
And yet he wrote these marvellous poems after her death to her, didn't he?
He did, yes. Yes, he did, yes.
And then he married Florence.
Yes, 2 years afterwards, he married Florence Dugdale, who had been a family friend, who became more or less a secretary and his literary assistant.
What did he write here at Sturminster?
Well, whilst he was here, he was writing The Return of the Native.
And the native did return because he went back to live, or they went back to live in Max Gate.
Well, eventually, yes, he moved back to the edge of Egdon Heath, to Max Gate, the house he designed for himself,
Yes.
just outside Dorchester.
So this is the actual pen with which Thomas Hardy wrote Tess of the D'Urbervilles.
That's right.
I wish I could write just a few words with it, but I'd better not.
No, I don't think you better.
Too precious.
Yeah.
And we're sitting in a recreation of Hardy's study,
That's right.
amongst all his things that he actually had on his desk in Max Gate. Amongst which is that calendar, and there is some significance about that calendar.
Very significant. So you see it's set for Monday the 7th of March.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the day that he met his first wife, Emma Lavinia Gifford, when he went down to do a survey of the very remote church, St. Juliet, down in Cornwall, remember?
Yes.
She opened the door, and
That was that.
That was that, and the calendar has stayed.
How did these things get here?
Well, it was his second wife, Florence, who was very keen. She left them to the Dorset County Museum here in Dorchester. And these were, this is all the contents of his study at Max Gate.
Yes.
Preserved for everyone to see.
Pity that someone didn't preserve Egdon Heath. Egdon Heath? Well, where's it gone?
Well, it's all around us, but of course the Forestry Commission have planted a lot of trees on it some years ago now.
Forestry Commission, yes. Well, what would it have been like in Hardy's time?
It would have been much more extensive. Hardy put it all together, separate heaths. He pushed them all together. And of course what it would have looked like would have been covered almost exclusively in heather and gorse,
Yes.
which he would have called furze.
Where could one go to see any bits of heath, as Hardy described it?
Well, I think further east, around the tank ranges.
Tank ranges.
That's right, tank ranges. They do cut it up rather. Or better still, around Studland.
Ah.
Yeah, around
Yes.
Studland. That's of course not far from the coast.
To recline on a stump of thorn in the central valley of Egdon between afternoon and night, where the eye could reach nothing of the world outside the summits and shoulders of heathland, and to know that everything around and underneath had been from prehistoric times as unaltered as the stars overhead, gave ballast to the mind adrift on change and harassed by the irrepressible new. The great inviolate place had an ancient permanence which the sea cannot claim. The sea changed, the fields changed, the rivers, the villages, and the people changed, yet Egdon remained. Well, it's terrible about the loss of Hardy's Egdon Heath, but we still have this lovely river. What is the particular significance of this spot?
There are a number of weirs, but this is my favourite for the one that finishes off the return of the native. It was here that Eustacia Vi threw herself in, and her fancy man, Wild Eve, then drowned trying to save her.
Yes.
But that wasn't the only drowning. It was probably here that Retty Priddle, one of the dairymaids in Tess, drowns herself after Tess has married Angel, and she, of course, was in love with Angel, and she throws herself in here eventually.
Yes. Well, Hardy did tend to bring his novels to a fairly gloomy end, very often, didn't he?
Yes, there are only a couple of them that have happy endings.
Yes. It's the same with his verse, which I absolutely love. But that tends to be fairly gloomy and grey. But it's marvellous. Marvellous. However, as a finish to the end of the search for Hardy's, well, spirit, I'd like to go to the top of one of his heights, Bullbarrow.
Right.
There are some heights in Wessex, shaped as if by a kindly hand for thinking, dreaming, dying on. And at crises when I stand, say, on Ingpen Beacon eastward, or on Will's Neck westwardly, I seem where I was before my birth, and after death may be. In the towns, I am tracked by phantoms having weird detective ways, shadows of beings who fellowed with myself of earlier days. They hang about at places, and they say harsh, heavy things, men with a wintry sneer, and women with tart disparagings. There's a ghost at Yell'ham Bottom chiding loud at the fall of the night. There's a ghost in Froomside Vale, thin-lipped and vague in a shroud of white. There is one in the railway train whenever I do not want it near. I see its profile against the pane, saying what I would not hear. So I am found on Ingpen Beacon or on Will's Neck to the west, or else on homely Bulbarrow or Little Pilsden Crest, where men have never cared to haunt, nor women have walked with me. And ghosts then keep their distance, and I know some liberty.